We're looking at John's Gospel, chapter 18, and verses 15 to 18. And here we have the story of the denial of Peter. This is Peter's first denial. Chapter 18, verse 15. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "Surely you're not another of this man's disciples?" the girl at the door asked Peter. And he replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire which they had made to keep warm, and Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. This is an important passage, particularly for Christian believers, because it's a passage which deals with human frailty, human weakness, human fear, and maybe even human cowardice. And it's one of those things, therefore, which speaks to all of us, because we all suffer from these things to varying different degrees. Let's take it section by section, though. Simon Peter and another disciple. It doesn't say who the other disciple is, but by common consent, that other disciple is John. And John is writing the gospel here. And it's quite common for John not to refer to himself personally by name, but rather to put himself into the background. Now, it's interesting to inquire as to why that might be. Why would John do that? You might think it's out of a sense of humility, maybe. The idea of not wanting to push oneself forward to be put into the limelight as such. But whether that's the case or not, it's hard to say. It may simply be a literary technique where one is part of the process here, that whenever one refers to oneself, one does it in a kind of a third person. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. So I think that whether it's due to humility, whether it's due to the literary standard of the day, the way that was done, either way, we know that it was John who wrote the gospel, and John who doesn't want to put himself forward. This is the same two disciples who, later on we'll see, rushed into the tomb when they heard that the resurrection had taken place. So these two are very much together and working together, and almost stay together from this point on. So, because this disciple, that's the one that's not named, this other disciple, because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside at the door. So, here we are. We imagine a situation here where nighttime, maybe 1 o'clock in the morning, round about that time, and they're coming through a gateway, and there's a crowd of them. There's the temple guard, there's Jesus who has been tied, and there's a group of torchbearers as well, and there's Peter and John following. Now, Peter and John are clearly not part of that group. Maybe they're following at some distance. But the main group goes through, and they see them go through, Peter and John. And they don't know precisely what to do, what is the best thing to do. But there's quite a crowd there of people who are going to see Jesus being tried. But John, interestingly enough here, is known. Apparently he is known, it says, to the high priest. Now, what the nature of this relationship is, we don't know. It may well be he was related to the high priest in some way. We don't know. But we do know that he was known to the high priest in such a way that the high priest clearly knew him as a friend or as a a person of some repute or someone who could at least be trusted. How do we know that? Because he was admitted into the courtyard. Maybe not by the high priest himself, but by the high priest's household. So he was known to the high priest, known as someone probably who came and went to the high priest's house quite often, on numerous occasions, and was known. Now, this is a very interesting relationship which is not dwelt much about in the scriptures. We already know that one of the other disciples had come to the high priest's place that very evening before midnight in order to betray Jesus, and that was Judas. And Judas must have been known also. But here we're told that John knew that was the case too. Interestingly enough, Judas must have been amongst this crowd as well, because Judas had betrayed Jesus, and he probably went with the crowd as well to Caiaphas and would have been there at the trial itself. I would have seen all the things that took place in that trial and all the things that happened to Jesus at that point. Judas would have been well involved in that. But then so also was John. And it's interesting to see how, or we can only speculate as to what the relationship would have been with John and Judas at that point, and the way in which Jesus would have been observed by these two in two different ways. It's hard to understand what Judas himself might have been thinking, whether Jesus would at this point unleash great power and spring free of this captivation and unleash the entire kingdom of God in a powerful and retributive kind of way. That, of course, was not what Jesus had in mind at all. But John was there too, and John gains admittance because he is known by the household. But Peter is left outside. It may be that he's diffident or timid and hung back. Maybe that was one of the things. Maybe there's this feeling of cowardice and reluctance already beginning to show itself. But John went through because he was known. Peter waited outside the door. Said he had to wait outside the door because, and if it was a had to, then it would have been a case of, who are you? Who are you coming in here? We don't know who you are. But anyway, John went in. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back and spoke to the girl on duty and brought Peter in. Now, it's interesting that he came back. Why did he come back? Why did he not deal with the matter at the time on the way in? The suggestion which comes to my mind is that Peter and John were hanging back from the crowd. Peter goes straight through with the others and acknowledges his presence to the girl who was on the gate at that time. But Peter was reluctant to follow through and didn't come in. John, having entered the courtyard, looks around, sees Peter is not there. Why not? Peter's uncertain. He doesn't know the people there. He's maybe uncertain and even a bit afraid of circumstances here. So John turns around within the courtyard and comes back and says something and beckons Peter to come in and talks to the girl at the gate and spoke to the girl and brought Peter in. He's with me. That would be basically it. He's okay. But as he's going through, the girl on the gate said, "Surely you are not another of this man's disciples?" The girl at the door asked Peter. Now, all of this is a surprising thing, because if John was known, in what capacity was he known? And was he not known as being a disciple of Jesus anyway? He was so connected with Jesus, spent all of his time with Jesus, was one of the inner circle of Jesus, and even though he was known by this girl, who was part of Caiaphas' household, one could hardly believe that he wasn't known to be one of the disciples too. It's very unlikely that the girl would have said to Peter, "Are you one of the disciples?" but not have said such a thing or understood such a thing as with John. So how is it that John gains free and clear access? Only presumably because he's known to be a disciple. And at that point is unafraid of declaring himself to be such, as the girl would have known him to be so. One would expect that would be the normal thing. Hard to understand how she would have known him so well but not known him to be a disciple of Christ. So the conclusion would have to be that she did expect him to be a disciple of Christ, and also because John came and brought Peter in, she was assuming, therefore, that this man, Peter, was also a disciple, in the same way that John was. And at this point the girl says, "Surely you're not another of this man's disciples?" Another as in another one as well as John. But John seems completely unafraid, whereas Peter does seem afraid. And at this point Peter replies, "I'm not." The first denial. And it says here it was cold. The servants and the officials stood round the fire and had to keep warm. Peter was also standing with them, warming himself. So you can see the group of people. The officials were there too, all around the fire. And there would be Jesus as well. How do we understand this phrase by Peter, "I am not"? Well, I think the whole situation is infused with the idea of Peter's fearfulness. He could have been particularly fearful, more than the others, because he was the one who wielded the sword. He was the one who therefore could imagine that retribution would have been dealt out to him, if only because he had shown aggression in resisting arrest and had injured somebody seriously, wounded somebody grievously. And therefore he would have thought, I would suspect, that revenge and justice will follow that, and I'll be arrested too and crucified alongside Jesus. Whatever happens will happen to him too. Whereas John, I should say, maybe he's considered more innocent insofar as he didn't actually cause any damage or injury to anybody. But this first "I am not," therefore, comes out of fear and worry, it seems to me. And one cannot but help understand how this particular statement is maybe prompted by the immediacy of the challenge. It's a challenge that comes out of the blue. It's a challenge for which Peter is not ready. It's a challenge, "You're not one of those disciples as well, are you?" And for which Peter has to give an immediate response, and his immediate spontaneous response is "No, not me." We can understand it on the basis of when you're put on the spot like that, you give a quick, sudden answer. But let me skip over to verses 25 to 27, which is Peter's second and third denial. As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, "Surely you're not another of his disciples?" And he denied it, saying, "I am not." Must have been another person maybe, because there's a crowd of people there. And Peter would have been well recognized if the crowd of people were the ones who had arrested Jesus, because Peter was there and made a spectacle of himself by wielding the sword. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove?" And again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a cock began to crow. We can allow Peter at least one startled, sudden, unprepared denial. because after all, when you're put on the spot like that, you don't know what to say. But the second time and the third time, one has to say that that's not a startled, unpremeditated response. One has to say that what one has here is deliberate denial, not suddenly surprised response, didn't know where that came from, but having denied Jesus once, you have it a second time, and you have it a third time. And that first time of denial must have echoed with him, because it wasn't just out of the blue. This was following on the heels of only a few hours earlier, Jesus had stung him with incredible rebuke, saying, "You will deny me." And he had denied it, that he would do such a thing. So the moment that he did so, he must have realized the truth of that. And no longer can you say that this was a sudden and a provoked and unguarded response. From this point on, from the first point onwards, the second and third denial can only have been willful denial, knowing full well exactly what he was doing. And a willful denial of this nature can only really be prompted by fear, total abstract fear of what would happen to him if he declared himself to be one of those disciples. If he stood next to Jesus and said, "I am Jesus's rock." He could not face and was not ready for that kind of a challenge. But here's the important point for us today. And if we take away anything from this, we must take away this important truth, that even in the case of deliberate and willful sin, as it must have been on the case of Peter here, deliberately having been warned, denying Jesus not just once, not just twice, but 3 times. Why does it happen 3 times? Why is it given to us that this denial took place 3 times in a row? Why is that so important? And why is it a 3-fold denial? The answer, it seems to me, is clear. This rules out that this could have been an accidental, sudden, spare-of-the-moment denial. This was an embedded, willful, deliberate denial of Christ. And why is that important? It's important because it means that even after a willful, deliberate denial of Christ, there is still restitution. There is still restoration. There is still the hope of forgiveness and of restoring a person to where they were before. And that even in the knowledge of what Peter had himself done and who he had denied, and not just once, but twice, but 3 times, and with a warning beforehand, even in the face of all that, the sin and the denial still took place. And even in the face of all of that, restoration is still possible and actual and did occur, as we'll see later.